Hey everyone, this is Derrick Broze with the Conscious Resistance and Freethinker Radio, and I am extremely excited to bring you this interview with Mr. Tareq Haddad, who, if you've been listening to the channel lately and listening to the radio show, you've heard us following the story of the leaks coming from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons and, the Duma attack in Syria, the alleged attack. And we've been following this. We've noticed a definite absence of the mainstream corporate media talking about it. And here we are today talking to now a former Newsweek journalist, I believe, who was attempting to do that exact thing and to report on this major news story. As I've been telling you guys, I think this is one of the biggest stories of the year, if not the biggest. And we're going to find out all about his experience. First, though, if you don't mind, would you just introduce the audience a little bit to you and your work and your background?
Sure. Well, my background is very kind of complicated and varied, but so I was born in the Middle East in Jordan, and I'm half Russian as well, so it's kind of a crazy mixture. But I came to the United Kingdom when I was 8 years old. We came here as immigrants. My dad's a doctor, so we were lucky enough to kind of get an opportunity to, we were living in a very poor part of the Middle East in Jordan, so we kind of had an opportunity for a better life here. So yeah, and kind of went to most of my education in the United Kingdom, and then when I was 18, I went to university in upstate New York, did a finance degree. While I was studying finance, I decided I wasn't happy in that industry, and it wasn't what my true passion was. And that's kind of the time I decided that journalism was my real passion in life. It was kind of in the aftermath of the Iraq War that this was happening. So, one thing that really interested me, and I think is very relevant to the current situation, is that I was very interested in how, hundreds of journalists could get the Iraq War story, so wrong, and, kind of essentially take the country in on a path to war on information that wasn't, in the end, wasn't correct. So I, studied this intensely, learned a lot about how the kind of the history of propaganda and how governments all across the world, it's not just the United States, they have techniques for, that have developed over time in terms of how to kind of deceive journalists or how to manipulate journalists or how to get them on your side. So I was aware of those things, kind of throughout my journalism training. And then I think come to, I think it's either 2015 or 2016, I joined the International Business Times in London after I did my journalism training, and I worked at a regional newspaper. So it was kind of my first international news outlet opportunity that I started working for. I worked there for about a year, I believe. Did a lot of stuff about Syria. Obviously, my Middle Eastern background gave me an advantage, but also my studies of Iraq and foreign affairs is what I was passionate about. So did that for a year. Took about 2 years away from the industry to try and write a book, which we can get into if we want, but I don't think it's too relevant to the situation. So kind of after 2 years of trying to write a book, I decided, writing a book is a very kind of difficult thing to do, and I was maybe being a bit optimistic in kind of how quickly or how easily I could do it, and I probably need a lot more time and kind of improve my skills in order to do that. So I decided to come back to journalism and kind of just try and get on with my career and try and build my reputation as a reporter again. So I joined Newsweek this September. And that's kind of been a very kind of sudden change of things to now.
Yeah, well, I appreciate all that background. So you said you just joined Newsweek in September, but you have been doing work with the International Business Times and other outlets, and so you've got experience as a journalist prior to this. Just for everybody who wants to fully know where you're coming from. Okay, so let's move into where we're at now, though. So you've been working with Newsweek since September. You've been keeping your eye on Syria, and also I want to kind of touch on what you had said a moment ago about the Iraq War, and how could so many journalists get this wrong? I really appreciate you bringing that up, and that's something that drove you towards this, because I mean, here we are again dealing with what seems to be a very similar situation, and I think that it's going to be very disheartening, to say the least, to be 20 years from this point and looking back and saying, oh, look, the media lied to everybody then, and now we all know, like, it's pretty much generally accepted that the weapons of mass destruction were a lie in Iraq. Most people commonly accept that. It's kind of a non-controversial fact, but that led to the death of maybe, it's estimated over 1 million dead Iraqis, American soldiers and other people from around the world. So there are real world consequences for these lies. So I want you now to first, I will direct the audience to your website, where you've already done a longer write up into the stuff we're going to go over. But I would like you to address, what took place now that led you to tweet out that you were going to resign from Newsweek.
If I may quickly just address something about Iraq, you said, and I think it's very relevant to this situation. I think I wouldn't necessarily say that journalists. I mean, there are definitely instances where some people that journalists did lie. And there is evidence for that, and I kind of have written about that a little bit in my piece. I think for the majority of it is that most journalists tend to be deceived by the US government, and they're not aware of how propaganda works. And I think maybe we can get into this a little bit later. This propaganda has kind of evolved rapidly in the last few years. And so I think one of the really important things to talk about is to make people aware of how this propaganda has changed, because obviously the nature of the media has changed so much, and social media has become a huge part of the world, and journalists, media organizations are shrinking. So we're relying more and more on social media. So kind of you get this trend, or we have this trend now where the propaganda is filtered into that social media. So I don't know how much your audiences are aware of organizations like the White Helmets and Bellingcat. I mean, to me, they were very suspicious from the very early days. But now, because obviously as journalists, we can't make assertions without evidence and without facts in place. But now I think we can say beyond question that both of those agencies are were built purely for the mechanism of propaganda. The White Helmets were the group with a kind of very famously would go into chemical weapons scenes or bomb sites and stuff, and they would collect the victims from the rubble. Several journalists have kind of documented how they have links to the British military, and their funding sources are not come from people that have an interest in the war. They're not kind of this what's the right word? They're not just doing this for the goodwill of their hearts. And so I think, for people that want to look into that more, there's plenty of information out there. And then same with Bellingcat, they purport to be this group of investigative journalists that are, defending, I guess, or any time that anyone raises a question about the Syrian narrative that's not the official US government line, Bellingcat will kind of come in and very quickly attack them as being Assad apologists or Assadists, or those kind of things, and they tend to give evidence. I mean, they've never provided any never released a report that is contradicted the US government official position on something. And when you kind of look into their history and their funding, again, they're very much linked to UK and US militaries and the State Department, for example, and the Atlantic Council, which is a think tank with links to those organizations.
If I can
Um,
pause you for just a second.
sure.
Yeah, so I'm glad you're bringing these points up because these are all very relevant
Mm,
points. And yes, our audience probably is, for the most part, familiar with the White Helmets and, of course, Bellingcat. We've been going through their
mm,
narratives for this has been an ongoing thing. And you mentioned the Atlantic Council. I'm sure you're aware that it was only last May when Facebook announced that they were partnering with Atlantic Council to fight fake news and things of this sort. Atlantic Council is
yeah.
funded by NATO governments. And by time October 2018 rolled around, many independent media journalists, including myself and every single website that I freelance for, was
Hmm.
labeled fake news, Russian propaganda, and were promptly deleted from social media. Some people had their YouTube channels deleted, Twitter accounts, things like that. And I mean, yeah, so we've been screaming about this for a while, trying to get people to
It's
listen. And I
well,
think we're
great.
now seeing the larger implications of this.
Yeah, I mean, this is a really, really worrying trend where you see kind of Google and Facebook and Twitter kind of have huge contracts with the military, and then you can't, oh, not the military, with the US government, sorry. And then you are kind of seeing these kind of very subtle, um, delisting of accounts that are not supportive of those governments, or, Twitter suspensions or rankings, getting reduced, or people's YouTubes, not coming up on suggested videos and things like that. So that's a very worrying trend at the moment. I think people really need to start spreading the word about that, because, and that's part of the reason I want to talk about this Syria thing, is that we're very, very, very quickly sliding into authoritarian system, and some people will say we have been, but I mean, one of the reasons I'm a journalist is that, like, I think that freedom of speech and the freedom of the press is one of the most important inventions of the Western world. Um, and the world has become so much of a better place because of that discovery. But we're quickly sliding down a very dangerous path if we don't start taking action on this. Sorry, I forgot what your
No, we're good. I think we're touching on a lot of important points, but so let's start to bring it to where you're at with
sure.
Newsweek. We've kind of set the stage for what's going on. We have all that going on in the background. We got WikiLeaks starting to release, various emails and people from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons starting to speak out and saying, the final reports don't match up with what we were saying behind the scenes. Bellingcat steps in and says, "Oh no, don't worry." Like you said, they basically play, guard for the U.S. narrative and say,
Mm,
these opinions were all looked at, but the final report, reflected what we all really felt. And then we
mhm.
get a new batch of leaks. These leaks just keep coming and disproving the mainstream narrative. And
Right.
you, as a journalist, figured, hey, this is a story. I'm going to write about it and tell us all about that.
Yeah, so it kind of started. Obviously, I've had a background of reporting about on Syria in my past, a lot, very frequently. So in November, when Donald Trump announced that he would be withdrawing US troops from Syria, essentially greenlighting the Turkish invasion that followed, I was asked by Newsweek editors to report on this, just very naturally, that I haven't knowledge in this field, so I was given the responsibility of reporting on that. And then about a week into the invasion, Turkey was allegedly used white phosphorus in on an attack on Ras Al Ain. Um, so I wrote about that. I did a follow-up piece about why white phosphorus still continues to be used to this day in militaries, even though it causes really devastating burns to the victims. It's kind of this chemical that just ignites as soon as it makes contact with air and burns at like 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit. So I kind of did this long piece about why this is still being used in warfare, even though we know that it's causes horrific damage, inhumane damage to the victims, and the pictures of those attacks are usually very gruesome. So it was while I was doing that investigation, obviously I was interviewing several people from different agencies and that are involved in chemical weapons. So as I was doing this research, I started to kind of hear murmurings about a whistleblower. Still nothing really confirmed solidly, like nothing enough for me to report on as a journalist. But pieces started coming together, and then I believe it was on the 25th of November. Peter Hitchens for the Mail on Sunday here in Britain published a piece that had the leaked letter that's in question. So from scientists on the ground, visited the scene, were unhappy that the final report published by the OPCW didn't include their original findings, and had changed significant portions that have a big impact. They tried to raise those concerns internally for about a year, I believe. Got pushed back, and I think that's kind of what led them to go public with this, or to leak that information out to the press, because they felt that their protestations within the organizations were not going anywhere. So that it was when I saw the Mail on Sunday piece that I decided, I approached my editors to write about it. So yeah, I don't know where you'd like me to go from here.
Well, so you approached the editors to write it. You can just take us all the way through it. So, I mean, obviously the reason we're talking today is because that article never came to fruition. And again, I'm going to recommend everybody check out his website. You can see the full blog, and he goes into detail here about what happened. But just give us, I guess, the kind of overview.
Sure.
You reached out to the editors, you put the story, and obviously it didn't make it to the the website.
So first of all, it was just kind of a face-to-face conversation with one of my editors called Alfred. Obviously I'm not naive. I understand that to kind of say something along the lines of what I wanted to report is a very controversial thing, especially for the mainstream media. And I would have never have approached, even though I've long had a held suspicion that, the Syrian narrative is not correct. I still understand my position as a journalist. I know that to make big claims, you need a lot of evidence. So I was only given that confidence because the amount of evidence that's now available is huge, as I'm sure you're aware. So I had a face-to-face conversation with Alfred. He asked me to write a note on our online messaging system to him and our foreign affairs editor. I did, with a kind of a fairly long explanation of some of the evidence that's available, and why we should do the story, kind of the same as I would do with most stories, but probably not in so much detail. Most stories I would just say, hey, this is going on, I've got the information from here, okay, cool, go for it. This, I knew that it was slightly more controversial, or it's a big story, so I went into fairly long detail about the evidence. And all of this is available in the piece that I've published on my website. So the initial reaction I received from editors was I knew from the very beginning it was worrying. So instead of kind of addressing anything to do with the actual what's involved in the what's included in the evidence or any other facts, it was immediately trying to denigrate where the information was coming from. And from my experience as a journalist, or even as a human being, you kind of tend to know that if the information is ignored and the person is attacked, that person usually actually has something valid to say, and it's just a kind of a character smear to try and get rid of them. So I was told that Peter Hitchens, who wrote the story, wasn't to be trusted. So he's an opinion columnist here in the UK, but he has a long, journalistic background, and he was a foreign correspondent for about 20 years. I think even split his time between Moscow and Washington DC for British newspapers. So it's not like he's kind of this weird just opinion columnist with no journalistic experience. He's got very good journalistic experience, but then drifted into opinion writing. And I was told, he's not to be trusted. And then I don't know how much your listeners will be aware of the Daily Mail here in the UK. So again, their reputation was kind of dismissed, or tried to be downplayed, even though obviously there are some issues with the website. I understand some people have some criticism of them because they tend to be right-leaning in their politics, but I think the actual newspapers themselves, regardless of their politics, still have very high journalistic standards, especially the Mail on Sunday, which is kind of, it tends to be a bit separate from the Daily Mail. The Mail on Sunday has its own team and they kind of do their own investigations, and they still, it's Britain's largest newspaper. It's the most successful newspaper in the UK, so they still have fact checking. They still have good quality editors that have been there for many years. So it's not this lower rate publication. It's still up there with
Yeah.
publications in the
The only
UK.
thing I will add to that, if people are aware of this, it's probably from the perspective that you're talking about. Like, anytime you share, if you were to share a link from the Daily Mail, somebody's going to say, "Oh, that's
Yeah.
that tabloid, UK." And I just want to mention in your piece when you sort of briefly mentioned the
Mhm.
Jeffrey Epstein story and just kind of comment saying, "Hey, like, this is also another story that's not being investigated. That's
Mhm.
something that we've been investigating here." But just as
Mhm.
a side note, one of the few places that has stayed on that story is the
Mhm.
Daily Mail, interestingly enough. So, it
Yeah.
has that reputation in some circles, but they actually do touch on stories and important topics that
Mhm.
nobody else will.
What's also really, I think, a lot of people might not be aware of is that obviously, kind of, we've had this shift in journalism to a more online presence, and different institutions have gone about this in a different way. With the Daily Mail, they set up a completely different team, which was known as Mail Online, and so they're the ones that they do the majority of the stories, and that's where their reputational problems have come, because they tend to be a bit more kind of cowboy, um, very fast journalism, just getting it from sources a bit more clickbaity, we would say. Um, and I think that it causes a little bit of confusion because the newspaper itself, the one that's in print, is still in very high quality. But when those articles get transferred to the website, it goes on under the same Mail Online. So it can be a bit difficult for people to differentiate, okay, what's good, what's bad. Um, but the actual newspaper itself is still high quality. Um, and there are some problems with the Mail Online website.
Let's move forward now to you. You brought the story to your editor, and I know that you, based on what you'd written, that this is when you started to notice problems. And I know there was email correspondence going back and forth. I'd like for you to elaborate on that, and then also if we can get into once you realized this story wasn't going through, which I do want you to explain, that you
Yeah.
started to kind of look at who your editors were and who they're connected to and things like that. And I think that's a really important piece of the puzzle too.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, as I kept pushing, the first thing that started to happen, other than the kind of smears on the sources, were um, I was referred to a Bellingcat article that um, refuted what had come out in these allegations, as and we kind of covered that already. Um, and so this is a very other interesting topic, is that we have a piece of evidence that's come from the Mail on Sunday, a trusted newspaper. That letter was then verified by Reuters. If people aren't aware, Reuters is kind of the wire agency that journalists have relied on. It's the gold standard of journalism, essentially. Um, that letter was verified by Reuters, and the editor in question, who I will get into now, it came to my attention, has kind of suspicious links to other organisations. Um, they were willing to kind of trust Bellingcat more than Reuters or the Mail on Sunday. After investigation, I started to have my suspicions. I looked into this foreign affairs editor. So he was a member of this think tank called the European Council of Foreign Relations, which is the sister act of the Council of Foreign Relations. I'd heard of it before a little bit, but never kind of in the context of journalism, really. So I started to kind of investigate and look into it. There's still not very much published about their influence on journalism, as far as I'm aware, if anyone's aware of specific influence on journalism, then I'd be happy for you to send that to me. But kind of as I started to look into them, I started to realize that they have lots of fellowships and kind of training programs where journalists go and spend time in this think tank. Now, what's important to understand about this think tank is that it's the most influential think tank in the United States, and it's completely funded by the people who make a profit from war, essentially. People like the Carlyle Group, and I don't want to say any other companies because I'm not specifically 100% actually, but it's people in the arms industry or people of Wall Street that, for example, like Carlyle is an investment bank, so it invests in the arms industry and makes a big profit from the arms industry. So these journalists go and spend time with them, and then they spend time with a lot of Department of Defense and State Department officials. That kind of there's this revolving door between the think tank and those two government agencies. So that they spend a lot of time there, and then they kind of filter back into respective newsrooms. And as I kind of looked into the history more, became aware of Fareed Zakaria, his history of kind of working with the Council of Foreign Relations and what role he played in the Iraq War. He was one of the kind of biggest sales people for that war. And yeah, it became very apparent to me that there's the problem in journalism at the moment is kind of due to this huge conflict of interests, in that journalists themselves have become part of the military industrial complex, where you have representatives from essentially this think tank sitting in newsrooms all across the United States and the West. So to me, it was no coincidence why a very damaging story about US involvement in Syria was blocked by the very same editor who's got links to these organizations.
Yeah, and I was thankful that you went into that in your article on your website, because I feel like, well, for one, I congratulate you and appreciate you being willing to do that, because just, speaking frankly, as somebody who has dabbled a little bit in the mainstream, but mainly stayed on the edges and more in the independent, there are things like these kind of connections that you're pointing to, that many of us have said over the years. Like you said, we don't always have the conclusive documents to prove, hey, A is connected to B, but there are various times where there are obvious, influences. Like I said, Facebook partnering with the Atlantic Council, 6 months later, independent media being deleted off. I mean, you can kind of draw conclusions and look at, and so the Council on Foreign Relations is very well known to people in the United States, especially those who are, I guess you could say, aware of the war industry, the military industrial complex, because they are a massive part of that. I hadn't even heard of the European branch of this until your article. So, but it's interesting that plays a role. So the editor, I know it's listed in the article. What was his name again?
Demi Ryder.
Demi Ryder, yeah. Was he the only one that you found had connections like this that were concerning to you?
In my particular newsroom, yes. I mean, I'm actually planning to write another piece about this, but it's maybe not particularly that surprising, considering there's another employee at Newsweek called Naveed Jamali, who is very openly says that he was previously a US spy. And that might not seem like a big problem to most people, but I would argue is that, of course that experience might come in handy, but the thing is that person is not trained as a journalist, even though he does claim now to be a journalist on social media. I don't think it's fair to call him a journalist, and he very clearly has a conflict of interest. Journalists, their number one priority is to hold their governments to account. And it's also very obvious that he still maintains a very close relationship with the government, because, what you'll notice is that at the time of al-Baghdadi's death, Newsweek was sort of celebrating that they had got the scoop, they had got the story that they were the first ones to report that. Now, if you look at that story, and throughout that week, there was a number of Newsweek exclusives where they've got a story that no other publication had got, even though before the New York Times or the Washington Post or whoever it is, they got these exclusive stories about the military and what they were doing in Syria. And then on all of those stories, you saw Naveed Jamali's name. Now, to get for a journalist like me, for example, to get that story would be extremely difficult. But obviously, there is this relationship between the media and the government where information is fed that is useful to the narrative of, okay, we're going to we've killed Baghdadi, which I'm obviously not complaining about, but when it's in the military interest to have information out there, that will be fed to the media, and they'll think they've done a really great job of reporting. I remember in our New York offices, they were celebrating with champagne, but to me, I was like, we haven't really done any journalism. Someone in the government's probably told us because we're hiring a former spy, and that information funneled to us. Real exclusive, real important stories do not come to journalists very easily. So there is that connection.
Yeah, I'm so thankful you brought that up as well, and I'm sure you've come across this in your own time and your own research. But I mean, we can go back to the 1970s, the church committee hearings in the U.S., which were looking at a number of things. But those hearings, it came out that the Associated Press, Reuters, New York Times, Washington Post, all were hosting journalists that had worked for the CIA. And there's a video, you can find it online, that whenever the congressmen were questioned about this, the man answering, I can't remember which representative was, kept saying, I think we need to take this to a private session. When he was clearly and directly asked, are there currently any former CIA agents working for your outlets? And they didn't want to answer publicly, but we know for sure that this has happened in the past, and I don't think it's stopped. And the kind of situations where you're talking about, it's sort of like ambiguous, right? Somebody goes from, oh, I worked in intelligence, but now I'm a journalist. But where are the allegiances? And like you said, these kind of exclusive stories, you got to go out and do some real, ground, hit the ground running and find sources and cultivate them to get stories like that. Whereas somebody who's got those connections can just, get a leak from one of their buddies or something.
Yeah, exactly. And it's never going to be a leak that's in the public interest, for example, or it's never going to be a leak about where the military is doing something corrupt or they're doing something illegal. It's always going to be something that is going to show them in a good light. It's never going to be. And this is I guess the interesting thing is that he makes no attempt to even hide his background. And when I first came, because I think he joined the company at a very similar time to me, and when I saw this, I was like, well, this is really strange. I mean, is no one going to complain? But I just started at the company. I wasn't going to kind of email my editor-in-chief and say, should we really be hiring a former spy but the industry was completely silent about it. And I don't know what other organizations are like, but I'm sure there's probably a similar pattern across other, and obviously I think it's probably first started in kind of cable news, where you started to see kind of these former military people come on as experts and analysts. And now I think we're kind of starting to see it drift into the newspapers as well. But I just thought it was interesting how it's not even hidden anymore. It's just saying, yeah, I'm a former spy. Now I'm a journalist. But again, like I argue in my piece, I think it's a clear conflict of interests, and these people shouldn't be working as journalists.
So tell us, what was the final straw that caused you to go ahead and tweet out and make it public that you were resigning? Obviously you could have resigned and maybe just kind of been quiet about it and gone to another job or whatever, or you could have done what probably some other journalists are doing right now and be quiet and just keep doing your job. But like you said, or you tweeted out that you wouldn't have felt good, internally, and that this is something you needed to do to be, I think, to stand by your principles and what a journalist is supposed to do. What was that
Sure.
final moment when you realized, and you described this in the piece, we'll put that link below, but when you realized, okay, my editors are not listening, I'm not getting any support on this, and there's something going on, I need to step away.
Yeah, so I mean, I kind of collected this evidence where I saw wrongdoing, and I collected this evidence about the European Council of Foreign Relations and all this stuff. So I was already, thinking about resigning. But so what happened was, because it was kind of an ongoing thing for a few weeks, what started to happen was one particular editor was kind of assigned to me, which is not something that normally happens. Usually, I would submit my stories, and whoever was free would kind of pick them up. But one particular editor started to kind of be picking up all my stories for editing before publication. And essentially, that editor, what they did, even though I didn't realize it at the time, just kind of tried to make my day job as impossible as, as hard as possible. Sending back very long critiques and trying to find flaw in anything possible. And on sometimes very small, insignificant stories, I'd be asked to try and get very obscure data or try and interview someone that was very difficult to reach. And obviously, I wasn't aware of anything at the time. I did my best to do those, to kind of comply with those requests. I just thought it was maybe a particularly, stringent editor. So I did my best, but it made my job very difficult because, and I explained this in the piece, in all the years that I'd worked as a journalist before, I'd never had any problems of people complaining about my fact checking or problems with the sources I've used or factual errors. Much to the contrary, without being arrogant about my abilities as a journalist, but I've always kind of been commended for doing a very good job and having a good relationship with my editors. So when I kind of kept pushing to try and run the story, the editor that I was speaking to, Laura Davis, she refused to talk to me in person about three occasions. And so on the last time that I asked her, she still refused, but she said, "I'm going to send you an email explaining, why we're not going to do the story." That email contained one paragraph, which was again just saying Bellingcat have said this is a fake story, essentially. And the rest of the email was like a character assassination of my abilities as a journalist. And it all come from that particular editor. So it became very clear to me that he was assigned to me for kind of this pure purpose of kind of finding whatever flaw he could find in my reputation, so they could use that as their defense to say, listen, we're having problems with you as a journalist. It's nothing to do with the facts in the story. It's you as a journalist that there's a problem. So again, you're seeing the same pattern of the evidence and the information is completely ignored, and the people that present it are being attacked and vilified. And that was the moment I decided to resign, because I was very, very angry at this, because I've never had problems with editors, never had any issues, and it was just it felt horrible to be attacked in this way. I didn't feel like I deserved that, and especially because I have to make clear as well, I have to write lots of stories a day, and things like working on chemical weapons, or I was working on a variety of different stories that I thought were very important. They take a lot of time from my day, and I actually spent because I just started the company, I was very keen to make a good impression. I was trying to get these big stories, so I spent hours and hours outside of my normal working life, trying to find information on this story. So I felt really discouraged by the fact that I'd worked really hard on all these different things, and then I'd really done my best for the company, and I wanted to do the best job possible, and I wanted Newsweek to be a thriving publication, and then just to be attacked in that way after really trying hard for the company. I was really upset when that happened, and I decided to resign immediately after that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like unfortunately the situation took the kind of typical route where they attack the messenger, and that's exactly what
Exactly.
it sounds like you're saying. They start digging up things in your past, and so unfortunately that is something that we've seen, and I'm
Hmm.
glad that you were willing to take that step, because I'm sure as a journalist working for Newsweek, and like you said,
Hmm.
working on other stories that you wanted to write about from within that outlet, you had to give up something. You had to give up something to do what was right, and
Hmm.
I know that I appreciate it. I know that many other people appreciate it.
Thank
um, so just, I guess, leave us with your closing thoughts on this particular situation. There's a few other things I want to elaborate on, but this situation,
you.
you finding out that your editors might have some less than less than ideal connections, and people are attacking your
Yeah.
credibility for doing the work that you
Hmm.
feel like you're supposed to do, that's why you're hired to do.
Hmm.
You decide to resign, and then you put this piece together, and now you've been doing interviews, I hear, and kind of reaching out, but it does seem, are the attacks coming? Or you've even called a Russian bot yet, or an Assad apologist, these things?
I think I've had the occasional one, but I don't take it seriously. I think, to be honest, and I was completely surprised by this. The outpouring of support has been huge. I've received so many comments from people, and I haven't even had time to respond to most of them. But yeah, it's been a really good response from people. No criticism, and I think that's partly in due because I apologize in advance for people that are about to read it, but it's a 7,000 word piece. But I wanted to ensure that I put in all the details in there, so that if people wanted to question me, they can. And I think that's maybe been why I've not received so much criticism. I think it's just been media silence and hoping that this issue will go away. But as we've discussed, I think this Syria thing is getting bigger and bigger, and more people are aware. And thank you to people like you that are doing a great job in talking about these things.
Yeah, and I saw you tweeting that as well. And I'm really glad to hear that you have received sort of a warm welcome and
Yeah,
appreciation, because
I
as
really.
you hinted at earlier, I mean, I do think the U.S., the UK, sort of
Hmm.
Western nations, which have typically been seen as a bastion for liberty and for freedom of the
Hmm.
press, that we are moving into a more authoritarian direction. And sometimes it's
Absolutely.
very subtle. And it's things
Yeah.
like this that the average person might not pick up on, might not be aware is taking place. And there's so much, even with a growing distrust, mistrust of the media, there still are a lot of folks who are going to pick up a Newsweek and just assume everything they're seeing in there is the
Yeah.
truth, and that's the facts, and that's what they need to know. I know that I grew up reading Newsweek, and even as I've gotten older, I still read outlets nice like Newsweek, because there's people like yourself, but I still kind of have a skeptical eye of like, well, what are the stories that I'm being taught? What is the
Yeah.
narrative that's being shaped to me? And honestly, you've kind of confirmed the feeling that I've had, that there are people within those outlets. I mean, if you hadn't gone the route and kept pushing, and if you had said, okay, fine, you're right, Bellingcat's right, this is a non-story, then
Yeah.
maybe you publish a story that just backs up the official narrative, and there you
Mhm.
go, it just continues on. But you
Yeah.
chose to take a big step, and I think that's a part of it, is in order for us to destroy this narrative that is basically saying that people who are questioning the war and questioning these things, and who want to talk about it whenever potential leaks happen, like you said in the beginning, you heard the leaks were going on, but as a journalist, you can't just rush to the first person that says they got a leak. You want to let it play out. And as time plays out, the evidence keeps piling up. We have people, Jonathan Steele and others who've been reporting on this, and
Yeah.
people who've been on the ground, Robert Fisk and others who were
Exactly.
on the ground reporting and contradicting what we've been hearing for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your journalistic integrity and your willingness to do this. Um, just let us know. I mean, how do you feel now coming out of this and your story? I know it's still very fresh in you, but coming out of this, any future plans, anywhere else that everybody can keep up with you? Obviously, your website.
Yeah. I'm still weighing out my options. I've had a few offers from, you know, people to potentially work with. Nothing sort of set in stone. I'm also considering just kind of being, purely independent, maybe setting up a Patreon, something like that, and asking people to kindly donate. I probably will sort of make a decision after Christmas and the sort of holiday period. Sort of don't want to rush into any decisions. But yeah, I mean, I'm still very passionate about journalists. I think, and this is, I didn't address it too much in my piece, but and we touched on it there in terms of the slide into authoritarianism. There are so many important stories that are not really being discussed in the way that they should be. And I think one of the main takeaways from this is that I think Americans and people all across the West need to try and have a bit more of a concerted effort into pressuring these organizations into not having this conflict of interests and doing their job, holding them to a higher standard. I think at the moment they're given a bit too much of a free ride. All of us are kind of quick to say, oh, that's fake news, but I think that can sometimes be a bit, even though there can be truth in that, it can be, I think, damaging. I think instead of just saying, oh, you're fake news, I think we need to be saying, you're an institution that is there to provide the news, and this is something of vital public interest. You need to be better than this, not just, oh, haha, you're fake news, we don't want anything to do with you. I think, everyone needs to start being aware of these issues and kind of demanding better journalism. And the other thing I'd like to mention as well, I think I partly wrote my piece for other journalists. From my experience, a lot of journalists surprisingly don't have any clue about government propaganda or some of the history of this stuff. No one really knows, like the church committees that you were talking about in the 1970s. No one knows. I meet very few people that know that the Kuwait War in 1990, the first Gulf War, I should say, it was of exactly the same situation. In political science, it's called atrocity propaganda. The public opinion is split about something, and there is an atrocious event, and then it comes out years after the fact that it was not true. So that's what happened in Kuwait. It's what happened in Iraq in 2003, and it's this similar to what's happening in Syria. Obviously, we're seeing this evolution, as we talked about. The propaganda is now using social media. It's using this citizen journalism where, you're flicking through Twitter, you'll see a video of an alleged gas attack. We're all very busy people. We just take it at face value, and I think we need to start being aware that the things that are posted on social media aren't always what they appear to be.
Yeah, absolutely. And we talked about we were describing it recently in terms of weaponizing social media, and I think that's really the age we're at. And as far as the fake news thing, I think it goes both ways, right? Because as I mentioned earlier, people such as myself and many other outlets. There was a website I was writing for, which is completely independent journalists, some of them who had journalism degrees, others who got into through citizen journalism. We had a full team of writers and editors and took ourselves very seriously. I was called the Anti-Media. We built that up to having 3 million followers on Facebook and all this big thing. And then within one day, just totally gone, deleted, completely, wiped off Facebook. And it was because we could literally see, we would go and check the analytics, say from Huffington Post or a mainstream site, and check the analytics for our site, and we could see that there were definitely periods, especially around the time of the beginning of this Syrian alleged civil war, when we were outpacing the mainstream media, where we were reaching more people with the stories that we were pushing and out there. And I guarantee you, had we not been deleted, we would be all over this and using our outlet as best we could. So outlets like us, legitimate outlets who might not fit the mainstream narrative, we're not corporate things of that sort, but we're still doing real journalism. We got labeled as fake news, and that was used as an excuse to delete or scrub us or mess with us with the algorithm. And then at the same time, I will say there are folks who are very mistrusting and distrusting of the mainstream media because of stories like we're talking about here. And so to them, everything they hear from the media is a lie. It's just it's all fake. It's all like so they've gotten to that point, and I don't think that's healthy either. We're kind of at this point where people don't know what to trust.
Of course, and it's very dangerous. Obviously there are valid criticisms of the media, and I'm one of them. I'm included in that group. But yeah, it's very dangerous if we kind of if we don't have any media that we can trust, we need to have institutions that can be, report on both sides of the aisle with equal, equal scrutiny and without any bias, and really reporting the facts. And yeah, I think it's so important that we start to kind of people start to fight back or kind of fight for a better media, or demanding a better media than what they're getting, because it's and the reason this story is so particularly important as well is that because the media is failing to do its job, a United Nations body that's there for preventing horrific chemical weapons attacks is getting used in a very maligned way, and that is like opening the doors for horrific things in the future. If that organization is no longer trusted, it's going to open the doors for genuine people that are genuine dictators and things like that to use chemical weapons without the mechanisms in place to be able to investigate them properly, or to say who's responsible in those cases. And the United Nations was set up by the US and the UK following World War II, and we should be proud of what we did in that war and World War One. But we're now starting to be the ones that are causing these kind of horrific crimes, because we like to prosecute everyone else for kind of human rights crimes and stuff, but we've never really held ourselves to the same level of accountability. And I think we really need to start doing that. Otherwise, very important institutions like the United Nations and their subsidiaries are going to just crumble, and we're going to go back to this kind of pre-World War II time where horrific things can take place.
Yeah, and you did say it well there, that unfortunately the nations like the US and the UK, where both of us are sitting right now, they are not inclined to kind of put the mirror at their own actions, and instead are always pointing the fingers outwards. And this to me is why I got into journalism. This is why I do the things I do. I know that's why you got into this, because there are stories that need to be told, and there are obviously people that don't want them to be told. And it's getting more and more difficult in this age. The beauty of the internet and the beauty of the social media age, when it first started to come about, was the decentralization, the sort of independence that everybody could have a voice. And so that means some YouTuber sitting in his backyard could break a story, and go viral, just by doing the research and putting the facts out there. But that is very, very quickly, if not already totally gone, very quickly disappearing because of social media suppression, because of the controlled narratives coming from the media. I mean, we have 5 corporations controlling the media that most of us see and absorb, and we also have discussion of deleting topics off of the internet. I mean, like, as far as I wouldn't be surprised to see Facebook saying, okay, well, any discussion of the the Syria leaks, the OPCW leaks, we're going to scrub those because those are lies, they're inappropriate, So, I mean, we're at that point in time, but I do have hope because of people like yourself. And I want to recommend, if just any advice I can give, definitely set up a Patreon account, because I know that my listeners would be absolutely interested in supporting someone like you. And people like Caitlin Johnstone and others that you've come across have done very well by remaining independent and being able to afford, to do the work we want to do. And that's where I've stayed. We try to keep it independent here, and we completely rely on the viewers and the audience who want hard-hitting journalism to invest in it. That's the way we see it. It's an investment. And I know that somebody like yourself wants to continue to do that work. So I do highly recommend, look at all your options, but definitely keep your ears and eyes open to staying independent.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for this opportunity. Really, honestly, we need people. And this is, I guess, my biggest takeaway is that we need people just to keep telling the truth and keep, not accepting falsehoods for an answer. And I think that's the only hope, is that, people continue to speak out, and then slowly but surely, I think, the message will get across. So yeah, thank you for your work, and thank you for giving me the opportunity.
Absolutely. Go ahead and let everybody know your website one more time.
So yeah, it's Tareq Haddad. So it's TareqHaddad.com. And then my Twitter is Tareq_Haddad.
Awesome. We'll link to everything in the description below, and if you're listening on radio, we'll make sure that you get the links again. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to seeing where you go from here, what you do. I have faith that you're going to continue to be a great journalist, and I'm just thankful for this conversation. So, thank you guys for listening. Please remember to subscribe, like, and follow, and check out his website. And as soon as he gets a Patreon or something up, go support this man for his willingness to speak truth in the face of such opposition. Until next time, guys, we'll talk to you soon.